Inside a young king's tomb, sealed for over 3,000 years, archaeologists found a dagger resting against his mummified body. Its blade wasn't bronze, and it wasn't gold. It was iron, and for centuries, nobody could figure out how Tutankhamun's craftsmen had made it, because Egypt wouldn't master iron smelting for another 1,000 years after his death. The metal in that blade came from somewhere far stranger than any workshop on Earth. Today, iron is everywhere. It's in the car you drive, the building you work in, the appliances in your kitchen. It's the most common element on the planet by mass, sitting right at the center of the Earth's core. And yet, for a huge stretch of human history, it was rarer and more valuable than gold. So how did people go from having almost no iron at all to building an entire world out of it? Let's start with that dagger. In 2016, researcher Daniela Comelli led a study using X-ray spectroscopy to analyze the blade's chemical composition. The results confirmed something remarkable. The iron in Tutankhamun's dagger contained high levels of nickel, a signature that doesn't occur in iron ore found on Earth. It occurs in meteorites. That blade was forged from a rock that fell out of the sky. You're not looking at a coincidence. Ancient Egyptians had a name for iron that translates roughly to metal from heaven, and they weren't speaking poetically. Long before anyone learned to smelt iron ore, small amounts of this sky metal occasionally landed on the ground in the form of meteorites, and people quickly figured out it could be hammered into tools, beads, and weapons unlike anything made from bronze or copper. Archaeologist Thilo Reren studied a set of iron beads discovered at Gerza, Egypt, dating back to roughly 3,200 BCE, nearly 2,000 years before Tutankhamun. Using similar nickel content analysis, Reren's team confirmed these beads were also meteoric, making them some of the oldest known worked iron objects on Earth. People were shaping fallen stars into jewelry before they had any idea how to pull the same metal out of the ground. Think about what that means for how rare this metal really was. You couldn't mine it. You couldn't request more of it. You had to wait for the sky to provide it and hope you were standing nearby when it did. That scarcity explains why early iron wasn't treated like a practical tool. It was treated like a sacred gift, something closer to a religious relic than raw material. A king could be buried with an iron dagger precisely because almost no one else on Earth owned anything like it. Meteoric iron shows up in small quantities across several early cultures, not just Egypt. Similar finds have turned up among the Inuit in the Arctic and among Bronze Age societies scattered across Europe and the Near East, each group apparently discovering independently that this strange, heavy stone falling from the sky could be worked into something sharp. Nobody had to teach anyone else this trick. The material itself practically demanded to be noticed. So, if meteoric iron was this rare, how did it eventually become common enough to build cars and buildings out of? The answer isn't really about finding iron. Iron ore, unlike meteorites, is actually one of the most abundant materials in the Earth's crust. The real problem was heat. Bronze, the dominant metal before iron, melts at around 1,000 degrees Celsius, a temperature ancient furnaces could reach relatively easily. Iron ore requires temperatures well above 1,500 degrees Celsius to properly smelt, a threshold that took people an extraordinarily long time to figure out how to reach and sustain. Archaeological excavations at Kamenkalahoyuk in central Turkey, led over decades by researcher Sachihiro Omura, uncovered iron fragments dating back to around 1800 BCE that show clear evidence of deliberate smelting rather than meteoric origin. Metallurgist Unsal Yalchin later analyzed the slag left behind in these samples, the leftover waste material from the smelting process, and confirmed that early Anatolian smiths had genuinely cracked the problem, building furnaces hot enough and controlling airflow precisely enough to pull usable iron directly out of ordinary rock. This wasn't an accident someone stumbled into. It was a technological breakthrough that had to be built, tested, and refined by real people standing in front of blistering heat, controlling bellows by hand, adjusting fuel and airflow through trial and error that could easily fail, waste precious ore, or injure the smith working the forge. Every part of that process carried real risk. Furnaces cracked under thermal stress. Impure ore produced brittle, useless metal that could shatter the first time it was struck against anything hard. A smith might spend days building up heat only to end up with a lump of half-melted slag and nothing to show for it. Getting this right wasn't guesswork repeated until it worked. It required understanding, even without the vocabulary for it, that airflow, fuel type, and ore purity all had to align at once. If you're enjoying discovering how much invisible struggle sits behind materials you barely think about, hitting subscribe means you won't miss the next one. Now, back to the forge. Picture the scene inside a Hittite workshop in Anatolia, roughly 1300 BCE. The air is thick with smoke and unbearable heat. A smith works bellows by hand, forcing air into a clay furnace to push the temperature higher than bronze workers had ever needed to reach. This knowledge wasn't shared freely. It was one of the most closely guarded technological secrets of the ancient world. We know this because of a letter that still survives today. The Hittite king Hattusili III received a request from Ramesses II, pharaoh of Egypt, asking for a shipment of iron. Hattusili's reply, preserved in the royal archives, apologized that the timing was bad, that iron production was currently limited. Historians generally read this as a diplomatic excuse. The Hittites weren't short on iron. They simply weren't willing to hand their advantage to a rival empire. For a period of real history, an entire civilization built its power partly around a metalworking secret, guarded the way other empires might guard military plans or royal succession. Then, sometime around 1200 BCE, the wider Bronze Age trade networks connecting these civilizations broke down. Copper and tin, the two ingredients bronze depends on, became harder to reliably source. Societies that had already learned how to smelt iron ore being vastly more common and locally available than bronze's ingredients, had a massive advantage. What began as a closely held secret spread and scaled into something every society eventually needed to know. That shift from meteorites treated like miracles to furnaces producing iron on demand changed almost everything downstream. Stronger plows meant more farmland could be worked. Stronger weapons and armor reshaped warfare entirely, and the sheer abundance of iron ore compared to bronze's rarer ingredients meant tools stopped being a luxury only kings and warriors could access. You are, quite literally, surrounded by the end result of that ancient breakthrough right now. The frame of the building around you, the metal in your appliances, the steel reinforcing the roads you drive on, all of it descends from smiths in Anatolia who spent years figuring out how to push a fire hot enough to melt rock into something useful. Tutankhamun was buried with a piece of the sky. You're surrounded by the version humans eventually learned to make themselves, and it started with people standing over a furnace, refusing to give up until ordinary stone finally gave way to metal. If uncovering the real story behind everyday materials fascinates you, there's a lot more prehistory to explore, so make sure you're subscribed for the next one.